Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. Learners, the topic of analysis that we shall be deliberating upon is globalization, responses from developing societies. We all know, dear learners, that globalization is a very important topic within the realms of international relations, international political economy, political science, international business, amongst others. But in the lecture, we shall be focusing on a very important dimension of globalization. Namely, we will first analyze the various ideas in globalization, and then with a specific case study of the developing countries, we shall discuss the impact of globalization on developing countries, and then conclude by looking at the net effect. If we look at developing countries as a case study, that what is the net effect of globalization, and above all looking forward for the future ahead. In the lecture, thereby we shall look at three broad aspects: globalization, developing countries, and the bigger picture of global governance that comes when we try to deliberate the impact of globalization from the vantage point of view of the responses that have come from developing countries. At the outset, let us ask, what do we mean by globalization? Globalization is a process of interaction and integration among the people, governments of different nations. Related to this process of interaction and integration is the next aspect, that is, what are the drivers of globalization in the contemporary scenario. So, it is driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. When we are debating globalization, we have to take into account that the very process of integration, interchange, interaction, as we discuss, involving dynamics of international trade, investment, aided by information technology. Dear learners, all of it show that globalization is multi-dimensional in nature. Now, this multi-dimensionality has another important impact, namely on environment, on culture, on political systems, economic development, human physical well-being all over the globe. So, then when we are tracking the responses of globalization from the point of view of developing countries, we have to take into account that there will not be any kind of uniform approach. Every region will have a differentiated impact on its environment, culture, economic scenario, human physical well-being, but amidst this different aspects of responses, one can track down certain similarities in order to approach our answers with respect to the question of that what has been the response of the developing countries with respect to globalization. As we are discussing globalization, we must also differentiate between modalities of past, present and future. Dear learners, by this we mean that globalization existed earlier also. But however, when we look at the contemporary time, in the present time, both as an ideology as well as a process, globalization has become the dominant political, economic, cultural force in the 21st century. And this globalization, with global markets, electronic finance, global trade, information technology, has an impact on the role of state as well as on the economy in a significant manner, both with reference to the developed as well as the developing societies. Now, as we are trying to understand the impact of globalization, with respect to developing societies, we must have often heard that how critiques point out to the very important aspect that small states, somewhere they find it unable, they find themselves in a peculiar situation to confront to the challenges posed by globalization. Thereby, there is a big question of transforming themselves into a competition state. Another related critique that comes, with respect how the process of globalization has worked, it is that globalization is nothing new, but that in the present scenario, international transactions are in the logic of capitalism, and that the trade, for example, when we look at the Silk Route, the idea of trade, interchange, exchange of ideas, goods and services, it dates back to centuries when we take the example of the Silk Route. Another related argument that has been presented when we try to debate globalization is that there is a protest. There is an argument that whether globalization is taking the world governance, especially when we look from the vantage point of the developing societies, that is towards homogenization of the world. Now, with this brings to us a very important aspect that when we are looking at globalization, that is, how does one first connote the idea of developing countries, societies? Dear learners, we all know that how level of economic development, income criteria, level of technological development, level of infrastructure development is a criteria to rate the countries with respect to the development paradigm. Countries which are advanced with respect to per capita income, industrial development, technological development, amongst others, diversification of economy, are seen as developed world, and countries which are lagging with reference to per capita income, with reference to economic development, are looked as developing societies. Further, when we are deliberating developing societies, we have to take into account that there is no homogeneity. That means perhaps when we look at the developing societies in Asia, that they are different with respect to developing societies that one may find towards the Caribbean or towards other parts of the globe. So, there is diversity, yet in this diversity we shall try to track down certain points of similarity which developing societies have seen with respect to the process of globalization. Globalization and state, whenever we try to track this perspective with respect to developing societies, we must get it in our answers that it has indeed somewhere strengthened interstate relation. When we try to talk about globalization, there is integration, interdependence on one another. Now, this interstate relationship, rise of bilateral and multilateral ties, new forms of governance avenues have an impact on sovereignty, both at domestic as well as at the external level. Let's take an important book that we must take into account as a reference point of view to elaborate our point. Dear learners, we take this book, which is States and Sovereignty in the Global Economy by David Alden Smith, Dorothy Jo Solinger, Stephen C. Topic. Stephen Topic, talking that how globalization and the bigger picture of what is the role of the state. The book points out that this is forefront of several contemporary debates when we hear about how states are putting up a question mark that whether globalization was useful or not. So, therefore, today globalization and the role of state is at the forefront of the contemporary debates. Then, to add to that, whenever we look at the global world, we see that how today there is intensity of international capital flows. We hear that there is a omnipresence global market. However, irrespective of this rampant increase in world trade, much more diversified global market, both in terms of financial instruments, as well as in terms of trading aspects. Yet one cannot ignore, that is, states are still important. So the argument that we get from this edited book, that is for our reference, States and Sovereignty in the Global Economy, the argument that we get is that a lot of it depends on how states matter. And further, one must also have an insight towards how are the differing roles in the global economy and geopolitical system. So therefore, this explains to us that with the process of globalization, the role of state in several developing societies is under scanner, yet irrespective of this wide diversity of world trade, world governance, both in terms of global trade and finance, states are still important. But one also has to look at what is the degree of significance the particular nation state has with respect to the power structure of the global governance. This brings to us another important side of globalization. When we talk about globalization, we just discussed that how today global trade and finance are important avenues when we look at the global world. Related to it is the aspect how there is a change in the global economy. When we look at globalized economic changes, we have several examples, namely online banking, rise of global markets and stock markets. When we hear about global franchises and organizations like multinational organizations, transnational organizations having an impact across nations and across borders. When we hear about the rampant online and electronic banking that have placed the world economy on an aspect of consistency and never giving up, and above all, always on the work mode. And to add to that, how euro, for example, as a world currency, give us an example of what it really means to have shared currency. Now, in this perspective, once again we take a very important reference to a book. The book is by Jan Netherwen Pirtes, that is Multipolar Globalization, Emerging Economies and Development, Routledge 2017. Now, this book by a very renowned globalization theorist tells us that how today there is a rapid growth of economies when we look at other territory of the world, that is Asia, or perhaps the idea of a collective entity like Global South. Then there is impact and shift in the world order also, that is new geography of trade, new economic and political combinations, new financial actors, the investors, the donors. Now, an important aspect that the book examines, that is looking at multipolar globalization, emerging economies and development, the book examines example issues like 2008 crash. How are the trends in inequality? How today over a period of time BRICS has come up as an important world forum. The changing fortunes of the BRICS countries, the bigger picture of governance and democracy, and above all, for example, when we look at global economy, in the post-Cold War scenario, there is rise of multipolarity, and this definitely has an impact on reshaping of globalization, which definitely speaks volumes about responses to globalization from developing societies. Dear learners, as we are talking about society perspective, with respect to globalization and the bigger project of the global world, we found that there is greater awareness of human rights, talk about transparency, configuration of the spheres, namely the public-private partnership. Now, amidst this, with respect to state market debate, distribution of wealth amongst others, what one finds here is that today societies are under a new aspect, namely that how with the restructuring of state and market space, there is also rise of new power avenues, namely the new technologies. Now, these new technologies, dear learners, we have to take into account that how they have influenced communication realm, how they have brought in the information age, how they have made the digital age possible, and above all today, when we look at the transition from 2G to 3G to 4G or to the bigger project of 5G for world governance, new technologies indeed are playing an important role, right from rise of new social media to rise of industry 4.0. Now, herein what we are seeing that information technology, which was one of the drivers of globalization, is forcing, revamping old ways of organizing responsibilities, namely calling for standardization, synchronization. And the big question that comes forward therein in this debate with respect to developing societies, that no doubt developing societies are coming up, having, making themselves flexible enough to adapt themselves to gains of technology. But the question of debate here is that one cannot ignore that social, economic, political disparities have also intensified. There are many examples where internal state dysfunction is on the increase, as evidenced by the number of failed and failing states, both in the developing as well as the underdeveloped societies. So, globalization has also then provided states with a greater claim of exceptionalism also. Related to the aspect of societal perspective, namely new media, communication, and to elaborate more on this point, we take reference to this book by John Sinclair, Advertising, the Media and Globalization, A World in Motion, Routledge 2012. Dear learners, we all know that communication is playing a very important role in any society. Society is impacted by dynamic relationship between media, advertisers, and herein society, especially the developing societies, are witnessing change because of this era of transition from mass media to new media, signified by social media. So, issues therein that comes forward which have a bearing with respect to important responses coming from developing societies, namely commercialization of culture, the big debate on the apparent impact on the social and personal life, and the argument that the book by John Sinclair makes forward, that is manufacturing, marketing, media complex. This book, which is very important with respect to understanding the realm of information, talking about advertising as an object of study, global trends in the advertising industry, and current issues in advertising, mass media, globalization, and world regions. And herein, developing societies indeed have some important concerns that they have raised with respect to this bigger, scenario that has emerged with respect to commercialization of information, communication, which has an impact on society, norms, cultures, values, amongst others. An important book that we take to elaborate further is by Anne Maria Bissaciar, that is Globalization and Governance, Essays on the Challenges for Small States. Dear learners, the book makes this very important aspect that we are all aware about the contested nature of globalization. However, one cannot ignore the fact, and that one agrees, that pace and intensity of global interactions have been multiplied exponentially over the last few decades. The big question that, and which the book raises, and this is no doubt having a very important bearing on the responses of the developing societies towards globalization, that is whether the state is in retreat or that the state has been reconstituted. For example, to take some references from the book, in one of the essays in the book, there is a talk that globalization and the Caribbean. And this essay argues that internationalization somewhere leaves no space for small countries in the Caribbean. In another essay in the book, that is Inequality and the Division of Gains at the Global Level, there is a big questioning on our models of economic theory. That is, the concerns of the poor countries are important only to the point where they begin to impact the well-being of the rich. So, dear learners, as we try to understand that how today developing societies are responding to issues of globalization, another important aspect is with reference to the bigger picture of law, and with the bigger picture of how this law contrasts or supports or complements important issues like human rights, or perhaps looking at how today laws have to be redefined with respect to new dimensions of globalization like science and technology. An important reference book that we take to elaborate further on this point is by M. Sharif Bassioni, that is Globalization and its Impact on the Future of Human Rights and International Criminal Justice. This book highlights that how role of science and technology is important to be factored for globalization. Now, with increased human interdependence and interconnectedness, one has to understand that there are positive as well as negative effects and outcomes. The concerns of states with respect to issues of national security, states' ability to govern, deliver public services are increasingly being challenged. And herein is the role of non-state actors. That is how the role, both as well the scope and reach of various non-state actors then comes under scanner. So, therefore, what has to be seen that values and the legal protection and human rights need attention, both with respect to globalization as well as state priorities concerning human rights, international criminal justice. All of it becomes an important topic of discussion. Another important aspect that we are trying to understand globalization with respect to responses from developing societies, dear learners, and to elaborate further on the solidarity perspective from developing societies, we take reference to this book by S. Mansour Murshid, Pedro Guillard and Leandro Esserino, that is South-South Globalization, Challenges and Opportunities for Development. This book argues that when we look at issues of failure of global regulatory policies which have a concern for developing societies, worldwide recession, financial crisis. So, macroeconomic balances between surplus and deficit countries. In this, the bigger solidarity collective concept of global south signifies partial shift in economic power towards developing nations. So, one has to have a corrective action with respect to tackling the macroeconomic balances and international policy coordination. One has to look at reducing imbalances, which also requires developing countries to raise their domestic consumption, and as the book argues, importing from the rest of the world issues and in international financial institutions to operate as a lender of last resort. So, therefore, the South-South trade, one has to see that one must acknowledge that it is growing rapidly, and one must look at it as an engine of growth for the global economy. So, dear learners, in the lecture Globalization, Responses from Developing Societies, we tried to analyze various dimensions of globalization and how today, with respect to trade, with respect to new legal apparatus, with respect to new norms, with respect to operation of global forces of finance and capital, global developing societies indeed have peculiar concerns, and all of it need to be seen with two perspectives, namely that developing societies are diverse, and this diversity has to be analyzed and researched with respect to look at points of shared concerns to factor them in to let process of globalization, development proceed in a holistic manner to let gains flow for all. Thank you very much for being with us for the lecture. We hope you all gained significant insights from the lecture. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you.